Let's start. Good morning or good day, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to look at the topic of resilience, climate change adaptation and mitigation in our new resilience policy that we drafted. In the policy, you will find definitions to the topics as well as some frameworks that we propose. And it's also full of some practical solutions that you can pick for your projects and use. This webinar is the first part of the two parts webinar. Presentation itself will take about 40 minutes, and then we have 30 to 40 minutes for questions, depending on how many questions we will have. For the questions, I would suggest that you either write them in chat or just keep them, record them and keep them until the end of the webinar, and then we'll have a questions and answer session. Webinar today will be done by Prabuk and Virginia, our RTLN members. So Prabuk and Virginia, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Anna. Today we will cover the outline. We'll just go through that now. We're talking about the resilience vision. Prabhu, can you bring it up? So we're talking about the resilience vision, our guiding principles, our guiding questions, and also some terms and definitions. We will then look at some resilience capacities and the global frameworks that some of this policy is based on and how it all links together. We will frame the resilience inside our conceptual framework and discuss the resilience pathway model in detail. And we will finish with some expected results and what the next webinar will cover. So let's just start straight into the vision. As a vision, ADRA imagines a future where communities will be resilient to all types of natural and man-made hazards. So that flows into a mission to assist communities to build resilience locally while contributing at the same time to the global discussions. Our goal, therefore, is for ADRA network officers to mainstream resilience in all sectors of our implementation and have robust mechanisms to disseminate the best practices and lessons learned, both within ADRA network, but also with key global stakeholders. So now we have our guiding principles. The ADRA policy revolves around 3 guiding principles as a basis. For each principle, ADRA recognises that it is the communities themselves that have the capacity to adapt to the changing environment. The community at the centre of the policy will be explained in the conceptual framework later in the presentation. But for now, our first guiding principle is to all communities where we work, adapt, and be resilient, so that support provided is meaningful and, more importantly, sustainable. Okay, so the next principle, our second principle, is that ADRA is a network which promotes climate smart and sustainable, environmentally friendly practices at the same time as we preserve the environment and biodiversity. Also, the principle around addressing drivers of risk and vulnerability is important when we address climate change and other risks within the community. The third principle highlights the inclusion of both ADRA's admin operations and its projects working together towards low or carbon zero emissions. We're hoping that in this way, ADRA will contribute to climate change mitigation process and minimise the impact of natural disasters that are related to climate change. So this leads into our guiding questions, and we have 5 guiding questions that frame how ADRA applies resilience to both its emergency and its development programs. They're intended to guide the positioning of our ADRA programs into the unique local contexts. So our first one, we ask resilience of what? And here we ask things like which systems, either social or economic, environment, physical or human, will impact the resilience of a community. The second question is resilience to what? So what we're talking about there is what risks are existing in communities and how could they be addressed? How residual risk can be addressed, and what shocks in the community are they likely to experience or maybe experience in the near future? So what kind of disasters are they prone to? That kind of thing. Third guiding question is resilience for whom? Beneficiaries of these kind of projects. The fourth guiding question is resilience through what? So here we're asking what capacities are required for resilience. And finally, now fifth question, is a resilience structure in place? So the types of questions we might ask here include, does the ADRA office analyse risks, both nationally and at a project level? And then do they use that and take risk-informed decisions to promote resilience and sustainable development? Also, are development and humanitarian programs working together to address the diverse risks? And this is both during pre and post-disaster times. Another aspect of this, we might talk about the ADRA office having business continuity capacities. Okay, so now Prabhuk will discuss some terms and definitions as we use them in the policy.
Thanks, Virginia. I'm a bit disappointed that we are not turning on our cameras because I even combed my hair today, but it's all right. Let's get into the terms and definitions.
Since you're the presenter, you could present.
No, this is good. So with the terms and definitions, we actually as a team looked at the many sources and came up with the best definitions possible given the framework that we are pursuing. Because as you know, these words are used in different contexts and they're defined in different ways, even though they essentially mean the same. So we have taken these terms and definitions, looked at them a little bit closely and aligned them to what we are proposing through the resilience policy. And that's where we have these terms and definitions. So absorption is the ability of the community to cope with shocks and stresses using existing capacity. So this is more the term of absorption refers to the current capacity of a community. When we either enter or the communities that we work with. Shocks and stresses, of course, I think we all know this is to do with, you can say, slow onset disasters versus, rapid onset disasters. We can use different terms, but in the policy, we are trying to use the words shocks and stresses consistently. Adaptation is the action taken by community and related subsystems to adjust to the changing external and internal environment. So the capacity to adjust to the change is what we define as adaptation. The coping mechanism is the tools and approaches, the systems that are being utilized to deal with the disturbance or the shocks and stresses. Let's move on to the next one. I think these are well-known definitions. Disaster is when a hazard actually exposes the community to a certain extent where the impact, it has a significant impact on human, material, economic, and in the environment. So a hazard in itself, we know, is not a disaster, but when there is exposure and vulnerability of the community to this hazard, then we end up with a disaster when there is a significant loss of life or material and economic loss. Mitigation, the actions that take to reduce the severity and seriousness of negative results. This is the context in which this word is used in our policy. Residual risk, something interesting that I was actually learned a few months ago, is the risk that remains after risk reduction measures are implemented. And we will look at this word a little bit more through our pathways model, because we sometimes look at risk and we don't realize that it is actually residual risk that we are looking at, the risks that is actually left over. So we'll look at it a little bit closely. So we know vulnerability, you can read the definition, the increased susceptibility of the community or individual or asset or a system to the impact of the hazard. Sustainability, the ability to develop without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now, these are some of the definitions that you can find on resilience. Basically, it is actually the ability to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover from a risk event. In essence, this is what resilience means. And of course, the ability to even anticipate is added in the UK National Infrastructure Plan definition. Essentially, when you look at resilience, you cannot discuss resilience without discussing risk. So the lower the risk, we can say the systems are more resilient. So I can give you an example. When we plan a water system, for example, if at all it is a new intervention, you do something called risk-inclusive planning, where you look at the geography, where you place the water tanks, from where you get the water source, how exposed it is to contamination, how these systems will be maintained, and you look at all these at the planning stage, you reduce the risk as much as possible, and therefore you can say that the water system that you build is going to be more resilient in the future. So the same principle applies to every project context. It applies to standards, the finances, the operating and maintenance standards that we have, because if we reduce risk, then we are essentially increasing resilience in a broader scale. So the resilience actually deals with the capacity of systems to manage and to bounce back from a shock and stressor. But sustainability actually looks at more to continue the development indefinitely without affecting the future. Now, resilience capacities is best discussed through a graph like this, or a figure like this, and I'll explain. So this figure actually we borrowed from Stefan Kohler, who was our presenter for the webinar series, and we can share the link for that webinar series on the chat box so that anyone could go and look and get more details about this. So we say a community is actually on a development pathway. Sometimes some communities do better than others, but all communities are on a development pathway. And at some point of time, there is a shock or a stressor that hits this community, and the development pathway is disrupted. And then there is actually a loss of development gains. So everything that the community or the government or the country has been working on for so long is now affected by this event, the shock or stressor that actually takes the community backwards. And the community obviously would try to regain its development pathway, try to come back to minimum, it will try to come back to its original development pathway, and at best it will try to even improve on this. And there is actually this definition called the resistance capacity, and that is actually analyzing the curve between the community, that actually how steep the curve is. You know, if at all the development loss is very high, then we can say the resistance capacity of that community was very low. But some communities actually has better resistance capacity, which thereby the loss of development gains is actually significantly less. Now, once you have this loss of development gains, the community gets back on track. Organizations have the responsibility to support, and that is where you have the adaptive capacity, where the community now starts recovering. And once again, the steepness of that curve or the slope of the curve is the adaptive capacity, but the curve itself will be defined based on the capacity of the community. Now, in many cases, communities will actually do much better, and this is called the reflective capacity, where the previous development pathway is improved and they do much better. And I think we all, as practitioners in the field, will know of many examples. I know in the Sri Lanka, after the Sri Lankan tsunami, the development path, even though it was a significant shock that hit the communities, within about 5-6 years, the development pathways are much better than before. So this is the reflective capacity, and therein we find this build back better concept, which is priority number 4 of the Sendai framework. And we'll be talking about this a little bit more under the pathways model. But before we go to the pathways model, let's look at some of the global resilience policy frameworks that we have brought into our policy and consulted in framing our conceptual models and all that we propose. So let me pass on the mic to Virginia for that.
Thanks, Prabhu. Okay, so you will note as we go through these policies, we're going to discuss 4 of them. That 2015 was a very busy year for the global resilience community, with 3 main frameworks being finalised that year, and the 4th just a year later. So the references to more information on each of these frameworks I've just put in this presentation, and it's in the policy itself. So our first one, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure the SDGs need very little introduction to this group. However, just to recap, the goals were created after the expiry of the Millennium Development Goals, which covered the period from 2000 to 2015. So while the Millennium Development Goals particularly focused on poverty, the SDGs were more like a blueprint to achieve better and more sustainable future by 2030. It's the official tagline. They consist of a collection of 17 interlinked global goals and a whopping 169 global targets. So out of all of that, 10 of the SDGs have 25 targets related to disaster risk reduction. It's important to note that the goals are integrated, and so that means that they recognise that an action in one area will affect the outcome in other areas. And development must balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Okay, so the second framework is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It matches the same time period as the SDGs. It is a global non-binding agreement, and it has 7 targets and 4 priorities for action. It's to prevent and reduce existing and new disaster risk. So this framework places a stronger emphasis on risk management and the wider scope of action. So this includes small scale and low onset disasters, along with the human-induced technological, environmental and biohazards as well. So the 4 Sendai framework priorities are understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage the disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and enhancing preparedness for effectiveness and build back better initiatives. You'll notice that there's a lot of risk terminology that Prabhu was talking about earlier. So our third framework is the Paris Agreement. And so the Paris Agreement specifically relates to climate change, although there are other aspects of climate change in other frameworks. But the Paris Agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. And they try to put it in the context of sustainable development and efforts to end poverty. So here the parties have agreed that they should enhance understanding and action with respect to loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. A key point of the agreement is that it establishes a long-term goal to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, very specific, not, and its parties agree to pursue efforts towards a 1.5 degrees temperature goal before the end of this century. So it's rather a long-term agreement. The Paris Agreement recognises the importance of averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Our fourth global framework that we discuss in our policy is the Grand Bargain. So this framework, what came into being after the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, it basically commits donors and humanitarian organisations to improving the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian aid. So resilience features in 2 commitments of the 10th work stream as part of this Grand Bargain. The first commitment is to use existing resources and capabilities to shrink humanitarian needs over long term with a view to contributing to the outcomes of the SDGs. It also aims to significantly increase prevention, mitigation and preparedness for early action to anticipate and secure resources for recovery. Commitment 3 as part of the Grand Bargain is to increase social protection programs and strengthen national and local systems in order to build resilience in fragile contexts. Now, the links between these frameworks is a critical step in achieving resilience. And the linkages are described in the resilience pathway model that Brooke will discuss in detail next. The resilience pathways model provides a logical and structured pathway for identifying and strengthening the programmatic linkages across most of the global frameworks. The key is to identify the systemic relationships and key outputs for each framework as suggested in our diagram. So the linking global frameworks diagram shows that these frameworks cannot operate in isolation of each other. If it did, we would compromise the primary rationale for why the frameworks were made in the first place. In this slide, the links between the key frameworks can be seen. On the left, there is a climate change theme identified in the Paris Agreement. The next slide, it shows the links with the sustainable development themes, and on the top left, and then the DRR themes from the Sendai framework in the middle left. And you can see how the link from climate change links into both sustainable development and disaster risk reduction. So these all flow down into improving resilience through preparedness, response, and recovery. So all stakeholders need to be aware of the risks involving their communities. And part of this policy, ADRA wants to ensure that collaborative analysis on risks and also wants to contribute towards the increase of risk knowledge by all stakeholders. So to achieve resilience, every aspect of the system must be resilient. It is critical that when we consider resilience, we do so from a holistic perspective. So that means that the causal relationships and the programmatic linkages of every aspect of our work must be evaluated separately and then collectively to determine the level of resilience. If we apply this interactive nature of the global frameworks, we can see the weaknesses in one area will have impact and possibly even result in a failure of a whole process through a domino type effect. So now we're just going to talk about framing resilience. In ADRA's vision, we imagined a world where a community is resilient to all types of hazards, both natural and man-made. ADRA's focus is on holistic resilience that supports the community's capacities for collective action that manage risks and improve well-being. The program aims to encourage diverse connections and the relationships between the communities. These assist the communities to plan and manage change and hence improve the community resilience. So in light of this, ADRA has adopted a conceptual framework that highlights 8 subsystems of the communities to focus on as part of its program efforts in building resilience. This conceptual framework highlights the factors or subsystems of resilience and has combined 2 key versions of the framework. Firstly, the work of CRS in the 2013 publication Towards Resilience, published in the UK. This same framework was adopted in 2016 in the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific. And secondly, the Community Resilience Framework in Sri Lanka, published by the Ministry of Disaster Management in 2015. So when we look at this framework, you can see in the very centre, the community is there, the people representing the community. And it's important to realise, as we've mentioned before, that the community is at the centre of all development and including resilience building. So I'm going to look at each of these subsystems in order. We'll start with environmental and then go clockwise. So with the environmental subsystem, in its programs, ADRA likes to contribute to the environmental resilience through adaptation and mitigation activities. ADRA believes that you must combine adaptation and mitigation and only the combination of the two will sustainably contribute to long-term community resilience. So I just want to step out of the conceptual framework and just remind ourselves of the definitions that Prabhu mentioned to us earlier around mitigation and adaptation. So just a reminder, mitigation is actions taken to reduce the severity and seriousness of events. So that might include improving energy efficiency, promoting public transport, promoting organic or biodiverse livelihoods, food sustainability, that kind of thing. Adaptation is actions taken by the communities to adjust with changing external events. So here we're talking about erecting buildings or infrastructure that is safer, more sustainable, replanting forests, diversifying crops to adapt to changing climates, those kind of things. Okay, so coming back to our framework, we'll head around to the next box, human. The human subsystem, where we're talking about food security, health and education. So people living within a community are the most knowledgeable about the community's opportunities and challenges. So that this forms the building blocks to community resilience building. We want our programs to build the resilience of communities by developing their resilience capacities in human knowledge, things like vocational skills, financial literacy, organic agriculture, food and nutrition security, those kind of things. Our third subsystem is the social subsystem. So as communities work together, they know about their potential vulnerabilities and they create relationships and partnerships that are essential in supporting each other. The impact of disaster and climate change on individuals are influenced by pre-existing cultural, faith and social beliefs about the roles and functions of each group within their society. And it's important to understand at this point that often faith leaders form a central part of these social building blocks. And this is because they're embedded into the community, they have wider networks with local administration and strong knowledge of local level needs. Okay, so ADRA's programs should be designed to promote engagement with religious leaders and faith community representatives of all religions, and facilitating a resilience literacy of each community. So in this way, ADRA programs will be ensuring a culturally inclusive approach. Okay, our physical subsystem. So here we're talking about infrastructure, water, roads, sanitation, that kind of thing. And so we're talking about the availability, quality, accessibility of the physical infrastructure. And so the idea is to make sure that we carry out our infrastructure developments through participatory community planning approaches, and ensure that our development structures have standards up to safety and take into account some of those risks we were talking about earlier. But also, and they need to incorporate an understanding on special needs such as disability or specific needs of women and children. Our fifth subsystem is the political one. So political systems do contribute towards the resilience of communities because resources are allocated through that political process. And so it's important for communities to understand the political and decision-making processes. So I'll just note that ADRA does not participate in political activities, but just engage with communities to ensure that they're well informed about the decision-making processes that would contribute to being more resilient. So this might be towards budget transparency or the funding of community plans or inclusive community administration leadership, that kind of thing. Number 6, we're up to the cultural subsystem. So large, as we talked before, large shocks and stresses can impact an existing cultural system. And some systems which promote resilience could be lost as different people are affected by large scale shocks. But there are aspects of culture that makes communities more vulnerable, and we need to recognise the cultural dimensions when we're thinking about our resilience programming. In our 7th subsystem, we have the economic subsystem. So here we're talking about income security, access to markets, livelihoods. And so when climate shocks occur, usually it's the poorer households are more likely to be affected. And so this is usually because they lack a financial cushion to access the opportunities to adapt. And so ADRA needs to design and implement different ways to leverage that financial inclusion for the vulnerable people that it serves. And we're talking about financial tools such as village savings and loans, associations, and just incorporating them into interventions so that they can help the poor and vulnerable manage unpredictable or shocks to their income. So if they have this in place before a disaster takes place, they become more resilient. And finally, our 8th subsystem, the institutional subsystem. Shocks and stresses will often destabilise vital institutional subsystems, which means key services might be disrupted, health, education, policing or others. So what we need to ensure is that institutional systems also have an enabling environment for our resilience activities so that we can encourage a level of resilience in the institutions that serve our communities. So in summary, all of these factors, all of these subsystems should take into account the cross-cutting issues that we have in our outer circle of governance, participation, representation, and leadership. And of course, the inner circle around the communities, you've got risk knowledge. And so as we've discussed at various points, risk knowledge is really important in understanding the way forward to improve resilience. So on that note, I'll leave it to Prabhuk to lead us in understanding the resilience pathway model.
Thanks, Virginia. Let's go into the resilience pathways model. And the chief architect of this is once again Stefan Kohler, who was the presenter for our webinars. And it was actually developed to the context of UNOPS and their operations. However, we looked at it very closely. We looked at the document as a whole. It was also covered in the webinar series, and you can actually have a look at it later on when you have time, if you missed it. But this pathways model is quite relevant to ADRA simply because we are involved in development and relief, both. Now, ironically, UNOPS is more involved in the development sphere or the development stream, to use the correct language in the pathways model. But ADRA, we are involved in both streams, and therefore the pathways model actually helps us make sense of how we can link these two streams to ensure communities that we work with are more resilient. The key word in this whole pathways model is risk. It is the key word even in the Sendai framework. We actually sometimes get sidetracked when we use disaster risk. We focus more on disaster and less on risk, but actually it's essentially dealing with risk. Risk needs to be managed and not disasters. These are some key phrases that stand out and that I wanted to highlight. In development, we remove risk from development, and in the emergency sector or the emergency stream, we remove people from risk. So there is now a natural link between development and the emergency streams. If we leave risk unattended to within the development stream, eventually we have to deal with it through an emergency response or within the emergency stream. How well we deal with risk depends on how much of investment is needed within the emergency stream to address that residual risk, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. So this key sentence, I would like to leave with you. Think about it: removing risk from development versus removing people from risk. So the pathways model actually proposes three main approaches that we take. One is a proactive approach, where we include risk-informed risk information in our planning and design stage. Going back to my example before, when we plan a water system and we do risk-inclusive planning, then we would actually integrate that information to our plans, and we would plan the sustainability of the system based on that information that we have, and therefore it is a very proactive system that we put in place. And we can say the resilience of the water system is much better because we have it was risk informed. The other approach is the retrospective approach, where there is an existing level of risk within the given development sphere. It could be a structural thing, it could be a community, it could be a cultural dimension, as Virginia has now expressed before, where an analysis is done to identify that risk exposure, and retrospective actions are taken to ensure that these risks are identified and dealt with. Of course, we come to the third approach, which is the reactive approach, where once a shock and stressor has hit, once a risk event has occurred, then we would look at it and have risk analysis done properly to look at why this happened, and then make sure that this information comes in to build back and to build back better. So it's a more reactive model. This is a visual representation of the resilience pathways model, and we have included this with a lot more information in the policy document itself. You can see the top part of it is the development stream, and the second part is the humanitarian stream. And you can see many arrows and lines that link it, but we'll look at it a little bit in more detail. So we'll start with development stream, and we start with data, the baseline data, or broadly data collection. This is actually something that we do as a standard practice with our projects. We do baseline data collection, we do needs assessments, but many times we actually don't proactively look for risk-related information if it is not needed. We look at it from the project perspective only, and we do needs assessment and we plan it. And many times I've seen, and it may be your experience as well, when we collect data, baseline data, we collect baseline data only to complement the indicators that we have in most cases, because sometimes we want to be smart in using our finances, our resources. However, through the pathways model, we highlight that even from the baseline data needs assessment level itself, it is very important to collect necessary information of assets and capacities of key stakeholders to manage these assets or manage whatever that we do. And this is a very important component, because the quality of the information we get at the start is what would inform us later on. These are some of the guiding questions that country officers could actually refer to. This is certainly not the only questions that we can come up with. Country officers can be creative based on their context to include questions that try to highlight the risk information that needs to be gathered. The next component is under data collection still, where we need to gather information related to shocks and stressors. Once again, if this is mainstreamed in our data collection processes, then we would have a lot of information on how we can make the interventions that we plan for resilient. Once the data is collected, so here are some of the guiding questions. Once again, these questions are not limited or is not static in any way. It needs to be adapted and changed, and even added. A few more can be added based on the context. We go into data analysis, and we look at, let me take up my notes here. Yeah. So here we need to assess the risk and vulnerabilities in the operating and built environment. Informs new development and highlights inherent risks in the existing environment. The purpose is to identify the appropriate response to identified risks and vulnerabilities. So based on the data collection, the analysis needs to be done to identify appropriate risks that the projects or the interventions can deal with. And of course, then these are the questions. Once again, you can have a quick read through, but it is all in the policy which will be shared. Then we go into risk management. Once we have the data collected, the analysis done, there has to be an analysis done into how these risks can now be managed. Work towards appropriate policies, compliance standards, technical capacities, and technology are in place to manage risk. Goal is to have a risk-based development, balance between cost and acceptable level of risks. Now, we don't have an infinite amount of resources. Therefore, when it comes to this component, we need to ask the key questions, and we need to make sure that we have a balance between cost, and then leaving behind acceptable levels of risk. However, based on the policy, what we are suggesting is that this risk governance, the risk management component has to be integrated in our program design itself as a standard. These are some of the questions. Is the acceptable level of risk clearly defined? Who is responsible for designing, agreeing, and implementing risk mitigation measures? Have mandates been clearly defined across stakeholder groups? Are they known, etc.? Now we come into the implementation, as I actually mentioned before. Once this analysis is done, then of course we would integrate them into our policies together with stakeholders into our interventions rather, and they could be proactive if it is a new intervention and a totally new infrastructure. For example, it could be retrospective if you are working with existing systems, and if it is more or less dealing with residual risk, it could also be a reactive measure. Now, once we have dealt with this within the development stream, there is still what we call a residual risk, and you can see it there. The residual risk is actually is what we pick up in the humanitarian or the preparedness stream, emergency response, the preparedness stream, where the analysis need to be done to look at what risks now remain after the development work is done. When the development work is going on, even if it's initiated by the governments, there's always a residual risk that needs to be analyzed. This risk needs to be actually analyzed and recorded. Residual risk that is not eliminated by proactive, retrospective, and reactive resilience measures. This residual risk can be predicted. So if the analysis is done properly, we can actually predict the residual risk to say, okay, this road is constructed in these communities. However, there is a residual risk of flooding because the road was actually constructed a few feet above the previous level of the road, and therefore we know that there could be a flooding risk. That's just an example, you know. So then we can plan for that through many interventions. These are some of the questions that could be asked when looking at this data analysis component of residual risk. We go into the residual risk management. These are some of the questions that we can actually look at. Appropriate measures, policy standards, institutional capacities is supported to deal with the residual risk. And one of the key components is early warning, preparedness, and response strategies. Now, I know that our officers are engaged in this space and they don't come up with intervention just out of nowhere. And there is actually a lot of analysis done. So that's really good. Now we put it in this framework to see how it actually fits in. So early warning, preparedness, and response strategies essentially deal with residual risk that is left behind from development interventions. These are some of the questions that guiding questions. Are the early warning systems in place? Are evacuation plans in place for certain events? All of that. Now, once we have all of this in place, there at some point, a shock and stressor will strike, and still there will be an impact to deal with. Now, theoretically, if all of this happens quite well, the resistance capacity of the community will be quite high, and there will be no need, or maybe only minimum support will be needed for them to recover. However, this is actually a place where ADRA is quite active, where we actually are in the forefront. In many places, we are the first to respond. And even within the last few months, we have evidence that ADRA has been more or less the first to respond to many disasters around the world. Now, we can be more prepared. You know, pre-existing agreements can be in place with governments and stakeholders, and we have a good tool, which is the NEM, which actually encourages country officers to plan these responses beforehand, identifying stakeholders, the partners, pre-existing budgets and plans are all in place to respond. Now, what happens after a response? If at all it allows, based on the context, there needs to be still more data collected now about the hazard impact. What actually happened here? Why was there a failure? And that information needs to then feed back, go back to our systems. Again, this failure analysis and the needs assessments, the hazard analysis needs to go back to help us build back better. And then we go back into the development stream where we assist in early recovery and development. Therein lies one of our key linkages between emergency responses and development, where we are looking at what actually went wrong, and now we are helping communities to build back better. And this actually puts our intervention and linking response to early recovery and even development into a very clear perspective. So this path-based model is actually something really good that we have included in the policy. And we hope that we can explain a little bit more this path-based model so that we conceptualize the work that we do a little bit better. But that's, I would say, a quick look at the path-based model. The policy certainly has more information about it, and we can also make available the path-based model document for country officers to look at it. Of course, it's not in our context, but our policy has now adapted it to the context of ADRA. We have also identified some expected results, which would help country officers. For that, I will pass on the mic to Virginia to cover that section.
Okay, thanks, Prabhuk. So like Prabhuk said, we have some expected results we imagine from some of these frameworks and pathways that we've been discussing. We imagine that the implementation of the resilience policy will contribute to 2 SDGs in particular, particularly SDG 13, which seeks to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, specifically around the indicator 13.1, which talks about strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters. The second SDG is number 11, which emphasised creating sustainable and resilient cities and communities where we serve. So the purpose of this goal is to ensure that the communities are environmentally sustainable. So we're talking about using resources efficiently, reducing non-renewable resource consumption, reducing emissions, that kind of thing. Also, they are socially inclusive, so connectedness, enhancing well-being, reminding ourselves that the wealth of knowledge is already within communities as we build our efforts. And the third one being that the communities are economically equitable. So this is making sure that the opportunities are available to all and avoiding neglecting the needs of our most vulnerable. So in relation to the conceptual framework I described earlier, I'm going to list the expected results for each subsystem. I'm not going to go through them all, but I will highlight a couple in each slide. So the first one was the environmental subsystem. And here I want to talk about development planning that follows conservation principles in order to minimize risk. And the important thing is both adaptation and mitigation activities are included in the development of a holistic program. In the human subsystem, we talk about individuals having appropriate risk coping strategies and adaptation. So this is referring to a lot of the understanding of communities, some of the data collection we're talking about, recognising that we're all different and we need to understand community-specific resources. The social subsystem We're talking about all community groups, including faith groups, and they're are invited as active participants of the development process. So that's a key thing that ADRA focuses on already in most of our programs. Okay, so in the physical subsystem, I just want to highlight that infrastructure is adequate to allow communities to access basic needs, but also that any construction follows standards, environmentally friendly methods, low emissions footprints, and land use practices, those kind of things in order to minimise risk. Okay, so we have the political subsystem. We're talking primarily, I guess, about the accountability and transparency to and from government structures. And on the next one, our cultural subsystem. Here we want to focus on the cross-cultural consultation, faith-based coping methods, or mechanisms, if words work, and the economical subsystem. We're talking about communities having adequate resources, and this is resources both financial and physical to cope with the shocks. And the last one is the institutional subsystem. And here I just want to highlight that the institutional cooperation of the different bodies responsible for risk reduction and sustainable planning is important to be with those response bodies. So we're talking about the various government ministries, disaster management offices, that kind of thing. So I've just very quickly gone through the results. You would see that there are others, and I'm sure they should. Often many of your officers are experiencing some of those results already in the programs. So if I just, that's the end of our presentation for now. We expect part 2 of the webinar in 2 weeks' time. We may change the actual time of day that the meeting is on, so please look out for that. The topics we'll cover next time include resilience principles and values, resilience factors, resilience monitoring and evaluation, and briefly touch on the annexes to our policy, which include good practices and DRR resilience indicators. So now it's over to everyone for questions, feedback and question time. We will incorporate any feedback and questions into our final policy document. So we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Perhaps I have a first question, because you said that we need to work on the long term with the governance and with the decision makers, and it's the same idea that I read in the resilience pathway. So basically, in our humanitarian actions, we are just responding, but we need to look at the mitigating the major risks. So how would you see this would change collaboration with the other actors which are not ADRA in our ADRA projects? How should we approach that so the change is more long-term and sustainable, and we're not only managing residual risks all the time?
I'm not sure who you're directing that to, but I could start. So yeah, I guess it comes about with the relationships that our officers already have with some of these government ministries during disaster times, with the Disaster Management Office and the various institutions that are around, and including community institutions, the leadership committees and things like that. And it's leveraging those information, those relationships, so that we can have a voice at policy setting tables, that we can influence consultation. Often government consults in inverted commas, some better than others. And it's important that we, as ADRA, are at the table and that we can help influence perhaps some institutional processes. And it's also important that our communities understand what institutional processes already exist where communities themselves can participate, and making sure that communities are taking advantage of the systems that many governments already have. So that's what I would say. I don't know, Prabhu, if you want to add some more.
Yeah, sure, Virginia, thanks. I think you covered it quite well. I want to bring in this dimension once again from the path-based model. And let me share my screen. When we do development work, we talk about sustainability. We talk about partnering with stakeholders, government stakeholders, and even the community to make it sustainable. The same thing is true with resilience. It is not just one organization working alone. You see within the government sector, the different ministries rarely talk with each other. So I think in all of our context, we may see the disaster management unit will respond to disaster, and then they will show that it's a success and end there. The information about the residual risk, information about the failure analysis, hazard impact data doesn't pass on to the Ministry of Water Supply, for example. There is no communication there. So as an organization, humanitarian organization, we have the responsibility to create those linkages. And also, once again, within the humanitarian sphere, with all the other actors, we have a responsibility to link. But I also want to bring in this dimension of, even within ADRA, we have PDAC that actually deals with more of the development sector. And we have EMAC that deals with the humanitarian sector. So if you look at the path-based model, stream 1 is more or less covered by PDAC, and stream 2 is more or less covered by EMAC. And this is why we have actually shared this, this policy document with EMAC and PDAC to hopefully jointly look at it. And then also find ways in which we can, within the organization, complement this flow of information that hopefully would actually mainstream resilience in everything that we do.
Thank you, Prabhu. Do we have more questions?
And now looks like we will not need that 1 hour for questions and answers.
Seem to be very clear. Perhaps.
It's just,
yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, and that's really, really useful hour to sort of pause and reflect on that, and I think it really sort of sets us up for where we want to be going. I know Brendan's on this as well. We had a conversation the other day, particularly around chasing some pretty significant funding out of Canada in the near future for climate change adaptation. And I really see resilience as sort of one of the nexus between our disaster response work and our development work. And increasingly, where can ADRA get its best bang for buck in playing in the climate change or climate action space? And I think what you're proposing here with some of the resilience strategies position ADRA well for managing risks into the future, particularly at the community level. So I just want to encourage you to continue thinking through also from a climate change or climate change adaptation lens and what that means for us, because I know ADRA is going to be increasingly asked, what is our climate change strategy? What's our climate change policy? What's our position? Where can we best leverage the church and the 24 million members of the Adventist Church around the globe too, to also show that we have a strong footprint for resilience to a changing climate. So yeah, just sort of not really a question, but just more thinking to help guide us in that space as we move forward, because I know that that's going to be a bigger focus, even for the US government too, with Biden administration. They're renewing their focus on climate change, and where is ADRA best positioned to chase some of that large funding.
Thank you, Michael. I will pass to Virginia and to Prabhu to answer. Yes, I agree with you. Even 2 days ago, I had a discussion with ECHO on their climate change policy and the environmental protection in their projects. And now it's going to be one of the essential cross-cutting issues in the projects, will be included in the project proposal template. And you see EU is also committed to by 2050 to be carbon neutral. So that there will be some actions in development EU projects. For the German government is the same. So I see a major shift there. The only thing that I would like to note is that we see this climate change issue as a part of the resilience. And if you look at the policy, it's also in our flow towards resilience. There is a climate change mitigation and adaptation. I see the climate change and mitigation and adaptation particularly going together. I would say if we would like to focus on it, we should focus on both. We cannot just pick, one side, and because the real sustainable change, I believe if you focus on both, on mitigation and adaptation, you're connected with resilience.
Correct. And look, I just saw Marcel is on here as well. So, and yourself, Anna, you were all engaged in that conversation with ADRA Canada the other day. So I think it's going to be an area that we do need to continue to focus on. And I think this resilience policy is a good tool that will help us start to think in that space. And I agree that we need to also be equipping our country officers with the tools to help them also come up with common ways for us to demonstrate that we are making a difference in this space, because we're 120 plus country officers around the network. If everyone's doing different things, it's very hard for ADRA as a network to demonstrate how we are making a difference in terms of moving towards carbon neutrality or minimizing risks, or whatever our strategy is going to be. But I think we need to find ways that we can all start to move in the one direction.
Just an update for the future. We are now finalizing our carbon proofing guide, which is written by Kelvin and adjusted, edited by myself, Marcel, and few others. So this guide will give a practical solution and tools, let's say, to the offices to mainstream this climate change mitigation and adaptation in our major development areas like education, health, and livelihoods, and now emergency projects. So some advices, some tips, some more practical views on this, as well as some theory. So we hope to finish it by the end of the month, or maybe beginning of the next month.
Good, excellent.
I just wanted to share about this policy itself. So we did a lot of searching when developing this, and it is not very common for major organizations to have a policy as this, and it doesn't cover the wide spectrum. So even when I was consulting with Stefan, who was the architect of the path-based model, he said they tried to implement it in Afghanistan but couldn't actually complete. So I think we are ahead of the game with this policy, and if we actually make it known widely in our network and take some internal decisions also to link the information that we have it's going to put us ahead of the game.
Thank you, Prabhu. Yes, Marcel.
Yes, just quickly to add what Michael was saying, maybe Prabhu, can you show the pathway model quickly? I would like to draw your attention a little bit to the gray parts. There is data collection, data analysis, data collection, data analysis, data analysis. This model is mainly living on data. And as you know, data is the new currency in this world. And I have the impression that we as a network with our implementing partners and so are quite weak in data collection and really know what we are doing. And you see here in this pathway model, this is the key to really understand what we are doing and move on and improve what we are doing, understand what we are doing, and so on. This is something which I would like you to take as a little bit of homework. How can we improve data collection, data management, and all these things? This is very vital, very key to this new process and to climate change adaptation, to find new ways to do that in a good way. There is still some homework for all of us, I guess.
Thank you, Marcel. I send you in chat one link with ADRA Germany. We recently found this tool, which we have not tested yet, but it seems like an interesting, comprehensive tool for gathering data on resilience, which is indeed looks at resilience holistically, not just a post-emergency DRR or something like this, but rather than really holistic resilience approach. So if somebody of your office is interested to look at this tool, most welcome. We also will at some point. It's not an ADRA tool.
Okay, good. But I agree with Marcel. I think data is the new currency, and unless we as a network can demonstrate by capturing and analyzing and sharing the data, we will never be a significant player in this space. So I agree. There's some excellent practical climate change initiatives and resilience initiatives happening at a community level, at a country level, but we're not so good at capturing that and putting that into something that we can share and be proud of to large donors who are looking to invest significant money into this space.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps we need to work more on this. For the mitigation, I for example, we already have few tools that they developed and which are pretty standard, this calculation in the office, and we will soon propose something like a calculation at project level, so you can actually put in numbers what you are doing, so you can show the impact. For the mitigation, we need to look for more qualitative tools, and maybe something like what I said could be a thing or something similar to that. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know if we as ADRA should look at a common tool for the whole ADRA, or should we just look of what is existing and provide a library? What do you think would be the best way for ADRA? Because I don't want to reinvent the wheel in a sense. From the other side, do we want to have something same for all the offices? That's more of a question to to you.
Ultimately, we do need a common tool. I think if we go to the network and say, this is another compliance thing like AAL, we will not get a lot of traction. I think there needs to be something really simple and some money that goes alongside this to start actually trialing and starting to capture it with a few countries and seeing where it goes. We do have tools now like Legalto, which potentially is the the way we can capture things in one place. If there were just a couple of high-level measures that capture what we're already doing in the network. The mini survey that ADRA Canada did recently, I think they had 23 countries respond, and showed that people were working in the resilience and the climate change space. I think we need to do a lot more of that mapping and see where people are doing, or countries are doing stuff and doing it well, capturing that and seeing how we can measure that in a simple way, rather than requiring them to do new things. I think it's probably finding out what they're already doing and finding a common way to capture that. Like Marcel, the data will speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Virginia, go ahead.
Yeah, just on the data and Legalto thing, there is features of Legalto that we're not using that I think we could really start to capture some of this. But also I think when we're mapping resilience, sometimes programs are not called a resilience program, it's a development program, but it has aspects of resilience or components of resilience within it. And so I'm wondering if part of this mapping process needs to be helping country officers to identify, sure, it might be a development program if we want to put a label on it in a box, but there are aspects of resilience like the VSLA, like some of the different crops we're encouraging. You know, it might just be a small part of the bigger project. And so even though country officers may say they're not doing resilience, they might actually be doing resilience in a couple within their development projects.
Yeah, I also feel there is a need for clarification. That's what I hope our policy, as we promote it further, will achieve. Because I feel when you say resilience, people think, okay, it's a Putin strapping after the cyclone on the roof. That's it. It's a little preparedness before the event. Of course, it is a part of it, but it's not a holistic resilience. Holistic resilience is identifying risks before actually something happened, and before you have to respond, and then acting on this. And when something is left, well, you deal with this after disaster or right before the disaster. So we need to look at resilience more as a cross-cutting towards everything what we do, rather than the little part connected to disaster, because I think it is not very sustainable if we try to just to mitigate and manage the fires and not looking at the long-term risks. Yes, Prabhu.
Yeah, just to complement what Anna said, what is the purpose of this policy? This policy is not meant to be utilized or applicable only for resilience-related interventions. No way. This is a policy for programs and emergency response in general. So even though we don't have a resilience project, every project can be looked through that lens, and that is why this policy becomes very important and needs to be rolled out, I would say, in much more detail with country officers and maybe even within the regions to fit in the context, providing even some tools. And that is why we have some guiding questions, So it's very important to highlight that this policy is not only within resilience related projects, but in our operations as a whole. Now, data collection, just going back to what Marcel said, there are several levels of data collection here, So we have at the most basic, starting from the baselines, assessments, we need to be programmed as a network to look at those through resilience perspective as well, because whatever we do, we need it to be sustainable and resilient. The two needs to be met. So maybe we can create some tools on Logalto, custom forms that could be adapted for country officers. So we can look at many ways. I would actually say that Logalto could actually play a major role with this data collection and having it as a central location for us to utilize the data for different purposes.
Thank you, Prabhu. Yes, Virginia.
Yeah, I was just thinking also beyond the data collection phase, but to document our lessons learned in our each project and our things that are working, like some kind of way or template or something where we can, you know, just manage that knowledge management stuff. All of that could be uploaded, and we could use tags, so you could just search on, you know, different sectors or interventions that you're interested in, and you can find it. So yeah, I think the Galdo has a really good role to play in not only data collection, but knowledge management as well.
Thank you for this. So perhaps we as RTLL should look, if the data collection is a major stone or major need we are looking at together with the definitions, because the definitions needs to be clear as well. You know, difficult to collect the data if the definitions are not clear, but if both are existing, perhaps we also can look in the future on some data collection tools. Virginia, your hand is still up. Do you have more comment, or do you just residual?
No, I forgot, sorry.
Okay. Do you have more comments or suggestions, questions? Also a question, do you want something specific to be covered in the second session, which is gonna take place in 2 weeks? We already have a plan, but maybe you feel that there is a need to look into something in particular.
Maybe, Prabhuk, you could bring up the topics, that second to last slide, just to remind people what will be covered, and if people see other things that should be.
Yeah, so in the second part, there will be few practical tips. It sounds quite theoretical, these subheadings, but actually we will look at some suggestions as well of what could be done. Yeah, and also proposing some templates and some indicators, some quite practical suggestions are there as well. Okay. Well, if there is no further questions, thank you so much for. Sorry, Kelvin, you wrote there something in comment. Do you want to mention it here as well? Okay, probably not right now. Oh yes.
Sorry, Anna. It was just more of adding to Marcel's comment that data certainly is a very powerful driver for successful, climate change adaptation and mitigation innovations, and more so, not to forget tools with spatial capabilities.
Can you clarify on the tools with the spatial capabilities? You mean like clarify for us what do you mean there? It's a geographical tools, right? Okay, Kelvin is gone. But yeah, anyway, thank you so much for participation. And it was a pleasure to present this policy to you and to have this discussion. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a second part. And maybe we will have a little bit of recap what was here, depending on who will all be there, just to remind where we stop. And then we will look in some practicabilities as well. Yeah, thank you so much, and have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Prabhu, Anna, and Virginia.
Thank you.